I'll leave the floor to you.
Uh, Thank you, Diego, for the really kind introduction and also for the invitation to speak. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm only sorry that I won't get to meet all of you guys in person. The paper I'm giving today is an article under review with an anthropology journal, so I'm very much welcome any feedback you have. It forms a part of a larger research project that I've been carrying out for the last 5 years, and is a part of a book project on this topic that I'm currently, as I was saying to Diego, desperately trying to finish before my daughter is born in August. So thank you very much again for inviting me. I'll just get on with giving the paper because it's definitely going to get to your 40-minute limit and might even push slightly beyond that, but I'll try to be as concise as I can. So it's a cloudy Sunday morning at the end of October 2017 in a cafe on the main square of a very, very small Italian town in the region of Emilia-Romagna. And in this cafe, a guy called Marco, who's a 35-year-old, very sort of well-built agricultural worker, shoulders his way to the bar to order an espresso. And that's probably how Marco himself, more or less, would describe his actions on that day, a description that, of course, in its banality and sparsity of context could apply to millions of Italians on any given morning engaging in the ubiquitous ritual of ordering a coffee. In fact, on this occasion, there was something almost insistently ordinary about Marco's coffee order, because the cafe that morning was extraordinarily busy. And so to get to the bar, he had to use some of his bulk to push and shove his way through crowds of people in order to do something that he usually accomplished with much greater ease. As I said, this is a very, very small Italian town, and its bars don't tend to get very crowded. But on this day, it was, and it was also very loud. Bursts of laughter and shouting coming from various corners of the room. And actually at the bar, there's a group of men about to break into song. So to perform successfully that quintessentially ordinary Italian ritual of ordering a morning coffee, Marco actually had to raise his voice quite loudly to make it heard over the singing, which he did, causing the song to falter for a moment or two before picking back up. No outsider, however, present at this scene would describe this particular act of ordering a coffee as ordinary. And that's because this very small Italian town happens to be Predappio, the birthplace and burial site of Benito Mussolini, founder of fascism, and between 1922 and 1943, dictator of Italy. The raucous crowd in the cafe were black-shirted neo-fascists come to Predappio to pay tribute at their Duce's graveside. So until the early 1920s, there was nothing terribly notable or extraordinary about Predappio, which is the seat today of a comune, which is a small local Italian administrative unit of about 6,000 people in the inland southwestern area of Emilia-Romagna. But before the 1920s, the population was in the several hundreds. It was very small indeed. For centuries, the comune consisted simply of an old medieval village, which you can see in this picture postcard here, centered on a hill fort like many other such villages in this region of the Romagna and neighboring Tuscany, with little or nothing indeed to distinguish it from those neighbors. A little way down the hill from this medieval village was a frazione, the very smallest Italian administrative unit of Dovia, which was a very, very tiny hamlet consisting of nothing more than a few houses and an osteria for travelers on their way to Tuscany. This is one of those houses in Dovia in the early 20th century, a house that will become important later in Predappio's history, because all of this changed very dramatically with the ascent of Predappio's most famous son, Mussolini, to the premiership of Italy in 1922. So Dovia was rebuilt from the ground up as New Predappio, or Predappio Nuova, a model fascist town, and an open-air exhibition of the early life of Italy's Duce. So on the left here, you can see an old photograph of about the midpoint of that process of construction. So before, there was absolutely nothing in this area. As I said, a few houses. Here you can see they've built large quantities of houses in the background. The open space in the foreground will come to be occupied by the very large building that you can see in the top right. That's modern day Predappio. That very large building is the Casa del Fascio e dell'Ospitalità, local headquarters of the Fascist Party, which actually now plays a quite distinctive part in the sort of public politics of Predappio. But I'm not going to talk about that very much today. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A session if you like. On the bottom right hand of the screen, you can see some more picture postcards of Predappio. This was, I'll say a bit more in a moment about the ways in which the regime kind of propagandized the development and reconstruction of Predappio. The creation and sale of postcards was one element of that. And in fact, the postcard on the bottom right displays the house that you saw in the last slide. That is Mussolini's birth house, which went on to form the centerpiece of one of Predappio's two main squares, and as you can see now has a grand staircase leading up to it, and underneath is written the house where Il Duce was born. In addition to all of this reconstruction in the town, an aeroplane factory was built into the hills surrounding it, despite the fact that this was the most useless place possible in which to construct an aeroplane factory, and in fact no aeroplanes were actually built there. But thousands of migrant workers moved into some of these newly built apartments that you can see in these pictures. Tourists arrived in tens of thousands, bussed in fact, by the regime to ogle at the straw bed on which young Mussolini was supposed to have slept. Today, the presence of Mussolini's body in the family crypt in the town cemetery means that Predappio is one of Italy's premier sites of neo-fascist tourism, if not the premier site. Furthermore, the particular day that I've just been describing, the day Marco orders his coffee, wasn't just any Sunday in October. It was the Sunday immediately following the 28th of October, which is the anniversary of the so-called March on Rome, in which Mussolini took power. It's one of three key anniversary dates on which thousands of neo-fascists dressed like this come to parade through the streets of Predappio. So today, for most Italians who have heard of Predappio, it is entirely synonymous with the man it gave birth to in 1883 and the political movement he led. As one nationally prominent Italian intellectual, actually, but from the local area, put it to me, the whole town is the Duce's tomb. So the crowd of people that Marco had to push through that morning was comprised largely of men with beards or shaven heads wearing motorcycle leather or pseudo-military uniforms. They were all wearing black, and the group that Marco's coffee order interrupted were singing Giovinezza, the official hymn of the Italian Fascist Party, at the top of their voices. But beyond making his coffee order heard, Marco paid them absolutely no attention. Neither indeed did other Predappiesi in the bar that day. So what could be more ordinary or everyday an action in Italy than ordering a morning coffee at a bar? But of course, there's something very surreal about this particular instance of ordinary life. In an aside in a lecture on being ordinary, Americans on the practice and the work, in other words, that goes into presenting yourself as ordinary, American sociologist Harvey Sachs once pointed out that some people's ability to do this, to perform ordinariness, is restricted. If, for example, he says, you're in prison, say in a room with no facilities at all, it's just got a bench, a hole in the floor and a spigot, you might find yourself doing things like systematically exploring the cracks in the wall from top to bottom over the years. But of course, it's not a usual thing to say, well, this evening I'm going to be examining that corner of the ceiling. The sense in which I want to suggest that Marco and other Predapiesi are restricted in their abilities to do being ordinary isn't quite analogous to this prisoner. They, of course, have things to do that are ordinary, that other people in other places do too. They go shopping, they cook, clean, go to work, have an ice cream or a coffee at the local bar, and in those respects are, of course, just like Italians all over the country and people all over the world. But they do those things in a context that they recognize others see as utterly and extraordinarily unlike most comparable contexts. So Valentina, for instance, is a very elderly woman in her 90s who lives with her sister in an apartment building on the main square of Predapio that was built by the regime to be the local hospital. And signs of those origins are all over it, and of course suffuse its architectural style, and she knows them very well. To do her shopping, she walks through her town, which she watched being built from the ground up in celebration of its most famous son. She interacts with tourists on a more or less daily basis, whose purpose she knows is to visit his grave, in the same cemetery, indeed, in which her parents and her brothers lie. Her local supermarket, where she'll actually do her shopping, is about 100 meters from the house in which Mussolini was born. So Valentina knows all of those things. She knows that cooking is ordinary, but that the apartment in which she does so is not. She knows that going shopping is ordinary, but she knows that most people don't do it in a supermarket next to Mussolini's house. She knows that giving directions is an everyday activity. Indeed, she has to do it almost every day, but that most people aren't giving directions to the tomb of a fascist dictator. She knows that tending to the graves of her relatives is an ordinary thing to do, but it's unusual to do it surrounded by men in black, marching around with their arms raised in the Roman salute. And Marco too knows that most people don't order their morning coffees in a bar filled with the same sort of men singing fascist anthems. Perhaps if Valentina or Marco were talking on the telephone about their daily lives to an alien or to a foreigner who knew absolutely nothing about Predapio, they could successfully do being ordinary in Sachs's sense, perform a certain sort of ordinariness by simply cutting away all of this context. And in a sense, that's what they and other Predapiesi often do by simply lying to outsiders about where they're from. And that's also why I say that Marco's own description of his coffee order would likely simply omit precisely all those details that would appear most extraordinary to an outsider. Because, of course, as soon as that sort of context encroaches, then ordinariness becomes a lot more difficult to do, although it is attempted, as, for instance, in Marco's insistent coffee order and his apparent, but rather cultivated, obliviousness to the scene around him. So how do we describe the attempts that Predapiesi make to perform what Sachs called being ordinary in the surroundings of a home that most people would see as rather extraordinary? What does it mean to have to work at producing the everyday or a sense of the everyday in a place suffused with the heritage signs and symbols of a political ideology that in Italy and abroad is seen by a lot of people as anything but ordinary or everyday? So in this paper, I'm going to give a very brief sketch of what such work looks like, what it looks like to work at producing ordinariness in this context. And I'll set out an argument in two stages. So I'll first try to distinguish between two senses in which we might speak of ordinary life as they emerge in social science, well, in particular in anthropological writing in the topic. I'm very happy to talk beyond anthropology later on, but for now I'll confine myself to my discipline. And my end in doing that is to point to a dearth of reflection on the ethnographic relevance of the category of ordinary life itself, rather than on its imputed contents. So what I mean by that is what I'll try to show is that ordinary life has, of course, become a category of anthropological analysis. It's become a transposable analytic that allows us to speak of ordinary life in Italy, for example, or ordinary life in the UK, or ordinary life in Melanesia, under the same categorical umbrella. But of course, it's not just an analytical category. It's also an ethnographic one with, as it were, an ordinary life of its own. That is, it sometimes matters to people in certain sorts of places and at certain sorts of times and for various sorts of reasons that the category of ordinariness or ordinary life takes a particular form and not other forms. That it includes certain sorts of things and not other sorts of things, and that it is deployed in the pursuit of certain sorts of ends rather than others. So I'll then turn to life in Predappio today to illustrate this point by describing the pursuit of ordinariness as a marked category that exists in opposition to fascist heritage, and this pursuit of ordinariness as animating much of Predappiesi attitudes to their history. And I'll conclude by returning to the question of the work that has to go into marking something or some person as ordinary by turning to another slightly surprising example of this work in action. So in other words, like most ethnographic accounts, of course, this paper is a brief description of ordinary life in a particular place. But in addition to that, what I would like to think is somewhat distinctive about it is that in this particular place, the notion of ordinary life has itself come to take on a marked and salient status. So activities understood as ordinary are not, by virtue of that fact, somehow unmarked, do not thus go without saying. In fact, often quite the reverse. Being ordinary in Predappio is very important. So rather than being a kind of site or a domain of existence, ordinary life here is the object of sustained work and effort. And again, in illustrating this, my aim is to partly to point to the importance of examining the category of ordinariness ethnographically, looking at when and why certain people and phenomena become important, not in spite, but precisely because of the fact that they're perceived to be ordinary. And attention to such context can also help us to see those ways in which we as anthropologists sometimes engage in a similar sort of project of scaling analyses such that the qualities of ordinariness or everydayness or concreteness, whatever, come to occupy a hypervalorized position in relation to some other set of categories, abstractness, for instance, no matter how distinctly non-ordinary those analyses themselves are. So despite the fact that ordinary life and everyday life are ubiquitous categories in anthropological writing, have arguably increasingly come to substitute for concepts like culture and society, we sometimes write as if straining in pursuit of an ordinariness that we never quite achieve, hoping perhaps like Marco that our attempts to ordinarify our analyses will be heard above the clamor of abstraction and theory around them. So claims to the scale of ordinariness matter to a range of social sciences, as I said before, but it's in anthropology, arguably, that ordinariness finds perhaps its most natural home. Indeed, ordinary and everyday can probably lay claim to being two of anthropology's favorite adjectives, perhaps trumped only by cultural and social, both the subject of recent and extended reflexive critique. What is in many ways our discipline's foundational monograph, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, famously includes Malinowski's injunction to anthropologists to examine the imponderabilia of actual life. But despite the enduring fame of that injunction and the fact that it's often misquoted to refer to everyday life rather than actual life, Malinowski actually only uses the words everyday or ordinary on 5 occasions each throughout the entire 600 or so pages of Argonauts. And the majority of such usage is simply and straightforwardly adjectival. That is, a certain ornament is everyday, particular occupations are ordinary, as indeed are some forms of sorcery or magic, say. But fast forward half a century to another great canonical text, Clifford Geertz's The Interpretation of Cultures, and things are slightly different. Not only do both these words appear with a great deal more frequency, but the grammar of their usage has also changed. So they're no longer exclusively adjectival. For instance, in the most famous essay of the book, Thick Description, Geertz describes the task of anthropology as looking at the ordinary. And the rest of the book is similarly filled with references to everyday life or ordinary experience, not as descriptions of a particular kind of life in a specific place, the wearing of certain ornaments, say, or the preparation of particular foods, as in Malinowski, but as abstract nouns, despite the fact they are, of course, being invoked to point precisely at the concrete and situated nature of the life they indicate. So something has changed, in other words, in the conceptual landscape of anthropology in the space of that half century between Malinowski and Geertz. Lots of things, of course, changed, but I think one such change was that ordinary and everyday went from qualifying certain phenomena as adjectives to becoming phenomena in their own right. They earned definite articles, so we get the ordinary, and they become, as Geertz puts it several times, worlds in and of themselves, or contexts in and of themselves. So in other words, they've gone from marking a certain sort of content as possessing a sort of quality within a given context to marking out a particular form of context themselves, the ordinary, the everyday. I think a persuasive case could be made for locating the origins of that change, at least partly in the thought and influence of Ludwig Wittgenstein on anthropology. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Geertz, for instance, famously drew on Wittgenstein and his disciple Ryle in making the arguments of Thick Description, and a number of Geertz scholars have pointed to the substantial influence that Wittgenstein had on him. And of course, at the same time that this is happening to Geertz, we also have Edmund Leach's Wittgensteinian argument in Rethinking Anthropology, the critique of structural functionalist butterfly collecting, in a very similar argument coming out of Rodney Needham that is very explicitly derived from Wittgenstein. Like Malinowski, when he invoked the imponderabilia of actual life, those sorts of arguments, Leach's and Needham's and Geertz, object to what they think of as bare bones or skeletal accounts of life. But unlike Malinowski, they now have a philosophical idiom in which to articulate an alternative. So the ordinary is suddenly no longer imponderable. Of course, the contemporary influence of Wittgenstein on anthropological conceptions of ordinariness and everydayness is at its clearest, perhaps, in a recent turn to ordinary ethics in anthropology, in which Wittgenstein is very often explicitly invoked. So, for instance, in his introduction to the groundbreaking volume Ordinary Ethics, Michael Lambeck notes that its title was chosen deliberately to echo arguments of Wittgenstein, and goes on to posit anthropology as a response to J.L. Austin's call for fieldwork in philosophy. Again, Vina Das's work is still more explicit in its acknowledgement of a debt to Wittgenstein, and especially to Stanley Cavell's readings of him, and her recent book, Textures of the Ordinary, is subtitled Doing Anthropology After Wittgenstein. So in all of these post-Wittgensteinian usages of ordinary or everyday in anthropology, the intention is, of course, to point to particularity and to specificity. That's obviously part of what makes these terms so well suited to anthropological use, given our historical preference for the ideographic over the nomothetic, a preference arguably inaugurated by Geertz, amongst others. Morgan Clark has recently pointed out that sociocultural anthropology, with its characteristic emphasis on participant observation and hence lived practice, could be seen as having everyday life as simply its normal subject matter. So to understand a phenomenon in this sense of ordinariness is to find it emplaced, to grasp its meaning in a given context, to understand its grammar or the criteria for its use. So it's to understand it in its concreteness, of course, to be able to point to it within a web of signification, not to isolate it from that web in order to provide some sort of universal definition. We, of course, know all of that. But as I suggested above in distinguishing Malinowski from Geertz, there is something a little paradoxical about these Wittgensteinian invocations of particularity. So a number of surveys of work on the ordinary, for instance, describe the apparent intractability of the term, the way in which it seems designed to slip out of your grasp. As soon as you, as an analyst, designate something as ordinary, it instantly becomes, by virtue of exactly that designation, something somehow extraordinary and worthy of note. My suggestion here is that that's not a consequence of some kind of mystical quality of ordinariness, but of the grammar, to use Wittgenstein's language, of our contemporary usage of it. Like the notion of culture, as Geertz, amongst others, famously pointed out, it functions in our usage as both generic category, the ordinary, and as its particular contents. So the category of ordinary life, or the ordinary, moves quite happily in abstraction with our analyses, from Italy to France to Melanesia to Amazonia. We find it wherever we go, just as we once unworriedly found culture wherever we went. But again, in many ways, like culture, part of the way we use the category is precisely to point away from such abstraction and towards the concrete contents of the category in any particular instance. My aim in pointing this out isn't just to highlight paradox that we have, as my colleague Tom Yaris just putting it, a generic interest in the specific, but to make the claim that, again, much as in the case of culture, as Geertz, Wagner, Marilyn Strathern, amongst others, have pointed out, whilst we are extremely good as anthropologists at describing the particular and concrete contents of ordinary life in any given guise, we have not tended to note the fact that the category of ordinary life too has, as it were, its own ordinary life, that it is sometimes important to people, sometimes important to anthropologists, that as a category it take a particular shape or form, that it include some things and some people and exclude others, that it be opposed to certain kinds of categories rather than other kinds of categories. And I think we've tended not to note that breathing life into a particular vision of ordinary life as a category requires work and effort. So we can see such work and effort in a range of contexts. For instance, in Sources of the Self, Charles Taylor has famously described the transvaluation of values by means of which the locus of the good life during the Reformation shifted from a kind of special range of high or abstract activities and came to be placed within life itself. Similarly, historian Claire Langhammer has noted the emergence of ordinariness as a political category in post-war British politics. So the trope of ordinary people suddenly begins to appear in films, on the radio, in churches, in the Queen's Christmas Day message, and in Enoch Powell's famous Rivers of Blood speech. And it also appears in, for instance, sociological mass observation studies. The vital role notions of the ordinary or of everyday life have played in 20th century French literature, and theory has been documented in enormous detail by Michael Sheringham, who traces the development of these notions from Baudelaire up to anthropologist Marc Augé. In France today, political scientist Catherine Neveu has shown that invocations of ordinariness can serve both depoliticizing and politicizing ends, sometimes distinguishing normal people from the dirtiness of institutional politics, and sometimes legitimizing contemporary forms of participatory and citizenship-based government. And in writing on contemporary meditation practices, Joanna Cook has described the ways in which ordinary life has come to take on a special and particular salience in the field of metacognitive interventions like mindfulness in mental health. So in all of those cases, what matters to people is not just something or some set of things that are by nature or by virtue of an analyst's judgment ordinary, but the claim that some things are ordinary. It matters that scales like ordinary life, persons like ordinary people exist, and in each case that they denote a different and specific kind of content. So to return to Predappio, the lives of most Predapiesi are eminently ordinary, of course, in their particularity. They do all the sorts of things that anthropologists often characterize as ordinary or everyday. They go shopping, cook, clean, order coffees, eat with their families and friends, have arguments with them sometimes, do them small acts of kindness at others. Obviously, they do these things in their own particular specific context, which is in many ways remarkable. But in some sense, every context is remarkable insofar as it generates ordinary life in all of its specific particularity. But what I'll try to show in this paper is that the category of ordinariness itself, not just the things in it, has come to take on a special and particular salience through Predappio's remarkable history and relationship to fascism. I'll try to show that the category of ordinary life requires work to shape, create, and pursue, and that it's this pursuit of ordinariness as a marked characteristic that underlies the attitude of Marco, Valentina, and other Predapiesi to their extraordinary home. So in a technical sense, life under the fascist regime ended in Predappio on the 28th of October 1944, when it was liberated by Allied troops and a detachment of partisans. Mussolini, of course, was executed the following year. I've listed just some of the many misadventures that befell his body after his execution. But on 30th of August 1957, it arrived back home in Predappio. Awaiting its return was the National Press Corps and a small group of family and devotees who were photographed, as you can see, giving the fascist salute at the cemetery. Just a week later, 3,500 neo-fascists turned up on a Sunday to pay their respects, with several arrested by the local police for making the same salute. And a week after that, a further 7,000 arrived, at which point the police tried to force anyone wearing a black shirt to take it off, leaving the cemetery full of men in vests. Today, the Sunday that falls nearest to the 28th of October is, as I said, one of three key dates for neo-fascist pilgrims who visit Predappio every year. The 28th of October is by far the most significant of the three, and it is usually the occasion for thousands of people to march from Piazza Sant'Antonio, the main square in Predappio, to the cemetery of San Cassiano, which is around 2 kilometers away, where Mussolini is buried. After the march, they disperse to buy memorabilia in one of three souvenir shops. Perhaps they continue their celebrations over food, or they return home. These marches are in many ways the most notorious aspects of Predappio's heritage. Every year, photos of them are splashed across the pages of national and sometimes even international newspapers. Journalists and television crews from around the world come to see what some people call the Mussolini Carnival. Now, of course, in general life, it's practically impossible for Predapiesi to forget their home's rather unique history, thanks to its urban fabric, the regular flow of nostalgic tourists, etc. But on these 3 days in particular, it becomes even harder than usual to pretend that Predappio is just an ordinary Italian town. Nobody I've ever met in Predappio has anything positive to say about the ritual marches, or indeed attends them. So Valentina, for example, whom we met before, is particularly offended by their use of Christian symbols. Elena, a local school teacher, along with many others, particularly dislikes the fact that they parade around in a cemetery, a place where, of course, many Predapiesi have kin buried. Some object to the presence of uniforms or to overt fascist paraphernalia. But the most characteristic Predapiesi response to the marches is to simply ignore them as far as is possible. That's true for most of the year, in which they are simply not discussed, even in the run-up to the anniversaries, when the press is full of speculation about what outrage to public decency is going to take place this year. Of course, Predapiesi are prepared for the questions of outsiders, and of course they're naturally unsurprised to find that the marches are an object of extreme curiosity. As I've said, they're fully aware of the status of their home as far as the rest of Italy is concerned. But in response to such questions, they'll likely, as I've said, express some sense of disapproval, dislike of the continued existence of the marches. But the typical Predapiesi response to them is to treat them as a joke or a minor inconvenience, as if an English village had suddenly been temporarily occupied by an army of Morris dancers. A characteristic sort of form that this ridicule takes is a story from Angelo, who runs another bar in Predappio, not the one I described originally. He recalls sitting with some friends outside his cafe, and he says, this man arrives. The man's a dwarf and old, over 60, and he's dressed in the uniform of the Balilla, shorts and all. That's the fascist youth organization. And he gives the Roman salute to everyone, clicks his heels, and says, "We will be back." This story of an elderly man in a fascist youth uniform is characteristic. Even more so is the idea that ritual marches constitute, as I said, a kind of carnival, a typical feature of life in a number of Italian towns and villages. Folkloric is an ubiquitous term that people use to describe the marches. So Gianni, who is a well-known local artist in Predappio, for instance, put it like this: it's just like carnival. Instead of being in the carnival of Viareggio, a well-known event in the adjacent region of Tuscany, we're in the carnival of Mussolini. Let them be, and they'll just go home afterwards. They're ridiculous. 40-year-old kids dressed up as senior fascist officers. Carnival is, of course, an apt notion with which to discuss the relationship between these ritual marches and what passes for ordinary life in Predappio, given Carnival's extensive role in social scientific debates about everyday life. Perhaps its most well-known invocation is Bakhtin's work on Rabelais, but it's also been employed by other theorists writing on the everyday, like Lefebvre and Georges Bataille, amongst others. And the point that such writers often make about Carnival, of course, is that it's an inversion or subversion of everyday life. The world turned upside down, time for a king of fools instead of a king, and of potlatch and excess instead of hunger and want. So in this literature, Carnival is a sort of special form of human action, a kind of willed and ephemeral escape from the strictures of an everyday life that, by contrast, is just there with all the weight of oppressive regularity. In Predappio, on the other hand, the situation is exactly the other way around. It's the carnival of Mussolini that weighs on its inhabitants and indeed appears beyond their control. And it's in a cultivated sense of ordinary life instead that Predappiesi find respite. We don't let it bother us, Silvana says of her and her husband, who are agriculturalists living just up the hill from Predappio. Sure, in the old days, we'd lock ourselves in. She's referring to a period in the 70s when these marches became an occasion of quite violent clashes with local left-wing activists. But now it's just a day like any other. Andrea, an office worker whose parents live in a hamlet a few kilometers away from the cemetery and who visits them every Sunday, makes a point of sitting in his car and waiting for the police to allow traffic to pass when the marching is finished. Why shouldn't I see my parents on this Sunday like any other Sunday? So I have to wait for a bit, he says, while they waste their time on this stuff. I don't care. The same attitude is visible in the cemetery. So Elena, the school teacher, visits her father's grave despite her strong disapproval of the behavior of the marchers in the cemetery. And I've seen her push her way through a crowd gathered on the cemetery steps, listening to speeches, seemingly oblivious of the fact that she stands out in a floral dress instead of black. The most striking demonstrations of this attitude are visible on the days of the ritual marches themselves. So the bar I mentioned on Piazza Sant'Antonio is open for business. Its taciturn proprietor is equally silently polite to all customers. It's packed with men in black, standing or sitting in groups, eating and drinking and waiting for the march to begin. But amidst this mass of black sit the cafe's regular Predapiesi customers, quietly talking amongst themselves, reading the newspapers, and generally behaving as if there's nothing unusual going on at all, by avoiding interaction and exchange with the outsiders, whilst nevertheless pursuing their normal routines. And it was on this occasion that Marco got up from his chair at a nearby table, walked calmly up to the bar until he was standing next to the group singing Giovinezza, and ordered an espresso at a volume calculated to supersede that of the singing. So because everything about Predapio's relationship to fascism is so patently extraordinary in a manner that Predapiesi understand perfectly well, because Mussolini was born there, because he's buried there, because it was built by the regime in its favored architectural style, because it was mythologized by the regime, because tourists were brought there to wonder at the Duce's humble origins, because neo-fascists have come on pilgrimage to it ever since Mussolini's body was returned in 1957, because a Google image search for Predapio returns pictures of shop windows with busts of Hitler in them. To be ordinary, because of all of that, to be ordinary is a means of escape. Nobody in their right mind believes that seeing an elderly dwarf dressed in the uniform of the fascist youth movement is ordinary. But when such things are in fact a part of the particular fabric of your everyday life, then being ordinary, in this cultivated sense, comes to mean something in opposition to such occurrences. And it takes work, it takes doing. So in this sense, ordinary life in Predapio consists of anything but tacit and unreflected practices. A sense of ordinariness in Predapio isn't the basic ground of existence, but the outcome of work. It takes effort to make ordering a coffee look normal when people next to you are singing a fascist hymn. You have to consciously decide to go to visit your parents, even if it means sitting in your car watching black-shirted marchers stream past you. You have to decide to tend the graves of your relatives on the same day in which their cemetery is turned into a fascist parade ground. And doing those things matters not just because of the things themselves, but also because they are perceived to be ordinary, far more ordinary than an acknowledgement of or involvement in what surrounds them. So the practices of ordinary life here aren't just ordinary because they're practices, but in part practiced because they're ordinary. So as I sought very briefly to suggest at the beginning of this paper, there's, I think, a sense in which anthropologists are sometimes engaged in the same sort of paradoxical pursuit of the ordinary amidst the extraordinary as people in Predapio, by subsuming the particular contents of ordinary life as a category into a general category, the ordinary or ordinary life, and then expending energy on ever more complex philosophical justifications for why it's this category of ordinary life, rather, say, than anything abstract or theoretical that should occupy our attention. Our concern in that respect for ordinariness can sometimes look as hard fought as that of Marco and Valentina. By way of conclusion, I'd also note that perhaps one of the most striking instances of that, the work required to do being ordinary in action and some of the paradoxes it can involve, is the inspiration for much of our interest in the ordinary, Wittgenstein himself, who spent most of the last 20 years of his life trying to persuade people not to do philosophy, whilst, of course, doing philosophy. And when I say persuade people not to do philosophy, I don't just mean that, of course, he sought to challenge the ideas most people had of what philosophy was. He also hamstrung what might have been the brilliant academic careers of several of his students by using his influence over them to persuade them to pursue occupations he saw as more ordinary and thus more virtuous, for instance, being a car mechanic. He was himself, of course, aware of the paradox involved, Intellectually speaking, for instance, he wrote in an unpublished chapter of Philosophical Grammar that all that philosophy can do is to destroy idols, and that means not making any new ones, including out of the absence of idols. And idolizing the absence of idols could be quite a good description for some contemporary writing on ordinariness. Moreover, and in a striking parallel with the claims I've been making about Predapio, throughout Wittgenstein's life, he made repeated attempts to ordinarify himself, or as his biographer Ray Monk puts it, to join the ranks. As in some of the ethnographic examples in this paper, Wittgenstein often did things, in other words, not just because he was interested in the things themselves, but in part precisely because he believed those things to be ordinary, and it was ordinariness that he was pursuing. So, for instance, he enlisted in the Austrian army as an ordinary soldier in the First World War, repeatedly resisted being commissioned as an officer, despite the fact that he hated his fellow soldiers and the whole experience of military life. Similarly, after the war, when he was a primary school teacher, he insisted on being posted to the most rural backwater he could find, despite once again hating the experience and his fellow villagers. And in the early 30s, he even decided he would move to Soviet Russia with one of his students to become an ordinary working man on a collective farm, a project that came to nothing because the Russians told him to go back to Cambridge and keep doing philosophy. And Ray Monk sums up this last example of Wittgenstein's pursuit of ordinariness and its failure as just one more manifestation of his perennial desire to join the ranks. Wittgenstein himself, Monk says, realized that he couldn't really tolerate life amongst the petty dishonesty of ordinary soldiers, yet he continued to wish it could be otherwise. So at the heart, in other words, of our thinking on the ordinary, we find a man who was anything but ordinary, just as Predapio, to most people who know it, is anything but ordinary, but who went to extraordinary lengths to make himself seem ordinary, just as many Predapiesi do. I'll stop there, I think, because I'm already way over time.